Welcome to the deep dive. We're cracking open a whole stack of material you've sent us today. We've got notes, articles, this brief history PDF, all focused on taking a really close look at Saudi Arabia.
A country absolutely central to the Middle East, yeah.
Exactly. And our mission really is simple. Pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts, and just the essential context you need to understand how the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia actually came to be and, what forces are still shaping it right now.
It's quite a task. The history is vast.
It really is. It stretches, way back through ancient times, covers that incredible unification journey, the huge impact of oil, and brings us right up to the challenges and, the ambitions of today.
And the scale of the place itself, you mentioned the notes say, nearly 2 million square kilometers?
Yeah, 1,969,000 square kilometers.
Yeah.
Massive, which makes it kind of astonishing when you realize that before 1932, it wasn't one single country at all.
No, it was a collection of much smaller territories, often competing too. And what really jumps out, I think, from all the material you've given us is how deeply everything connects. It's not just kings and battles, is it?
Not at all.
From the very start, you've got the geography, these complex tribal relationships, and maybe most profoundly, the role of religion. They're all intrinsically woven together. It sort of sets the stage for everything that follows.
It's fascinating how they intertwine.
Yeah.
So let's dive in right there at the beginning. Looking at the lay of the land, before Islam, the material describes the Arabian Peninsula back then as, largely barren, mostly desert and mountains.
Right, with life kind of clustered around these sparse oases in the valleys.
Exactly.
The notes actually paint a picture of a barren wasteland. They even make a point of contrasting it, saying it lacked the divine guidance found elsewhere, like, the Torah or the Bible.
Interesting framing.
It is. And idolatry is described pretty harshly, brutish, sensual, and cruel. This is all set against what the material calls chosen people in other lands.
And the people living there. Descendants of Sem, specifically us, known as Ush al-Arab. The notes mention early kingdoms existing, and the people being known for, martial arts and poetry.
Yeah, figures like Nabiga az-Zubyani and Amru ibn Kulsum are mentioned, poets.
And the material also points to what it calls infidelity signs before Islam became widespread. Things like female infanticide.
And foolishness, disbelief, poverty, humiliation. It lists quite a few. It even names some pre-Islamic cities found in the land, like Ashabul Rad al-Hukam, Ashabul Garkud.
Ibn al-Humayn at Arik.
Right, so this whole depiction of pre-Islamic Arabia as it's presented here really sets up the birth of Islam as this moment of dramatic, transformative change for the region.
Which, leads us straight into the birth and that incredibly rapid early spread of Islam. The notes pinpoint Mecca in the Hijaz region as the birthplace.
And Prophet Muhammad, born 570 CE, described as a descendant of Ismail ibn Ibrahim.
The Quran's revelation happened in Hijaz and also in Medina. And that migration, the Hujra, to Medina in 622 AD, that was pivotal.
Absolutely. The joining of 9 tribes forming that early Islamic community.
And after the Prophet's death in 632 CE, the spread was just explosive.
It really was. The material shows Islam expanding way beyond Arabia into Egypt, north to Syria, Mesopotamia, across Persia, even reaching India and parts of Europe by the end of the Bani Umayyad Caliphate.
Wow.
And you see these successive dynasties ruling the Islamic State, the Umayyads, then the Abbasids, followed by smaller regional powers, Ayyubian, Mamalik, Uthmania.
So a complex political landscape even then.
Definitely. By the early 16th century, Islam spanned 3 continents, but under different major empires, the Ottomans, the Persian Shia, and the Mughals in India.
Okay.
But crucially, the notes keep emphasizing the enduring significance of Mecca and Medina, the holy cities. Their influence on Arabian society was profound, leading to this real focus on religious understanding and law as central to, everything. Identity, governance.
Right. But that early, vast Islamic world didn't mean the Arabian Peninsula itself stayed unified in the way we think of Saudi Arabia now. The material talks about earlier attempts at statehood, specifically linked to the Saudi dynasty.
Exactly. There was the first Saudi state. That ran from about 1744 to 1818.
Okay.
The material calls it an Islamic utopia, based on imposing this very rigorous interpretation of Islam derived from Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teachings.
But it didn't last.
No, it collapsed. Apparently, after a military campaign aimed at Shia areas in Iraq didn't succeed.
Then there was a gap, and then the second Saudi state.
That's right, from 1824 to 1891. Its rise is linked to the Muhayyid mission. That's a term from the notes connected to Wahhabism and the al-Sheikh family. Turki ibn Abdallah, who was a cousin of the last Saud leader, ruled Nejd from 1823.
But that one also faced problems.
Yeah, the material mentions decline, internal conflict, things like Saud's exile, Ibrahim Pasha's raid. It says after its defeat, the Al Saud were kind of in distress, no longer really holding formal rule.
So these earlier attempts, they sort of highlight this recurring theme, don't they?
Absolutely. You see this constant interplay. Political ambition, this powerful religious ideology, and then these internal power struggles just playing out again and again on the peninsula.
Which brings us then to the figure who finally pulls it all together, Abdulaziz Al Saud, often just called Ibn Saud.
The notes describe him as an extraordinary individual, really emphasize his early life as being central to everything that came later and just his remarkable influence.
And the situation he faced in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
It was incredibly fragmented, right?
Totally. The material mentions distinct territories. The Hassimiya kingdom in Hijaz, Yamaniya in Yemen, Iwadian in Nejd, Al-Hassimiya in what's now Jordan.
A real patchwork.
And the notes use this strong phrase describing a long period of mutual slaughter between cities and regions. Grim stuff.
So how did Ibn Saud actually unify them? The material details his campaign.
Yeah, systematically. First, he consolidated Nejd. Then he brought Medina, Mecca, and those 10 small royal territories in the Hijaz together with Nejd.
And declared himself king.
King over Hijaz and Najd, yeah. He defeated the Hassimiya kingdom in Hijaz. The last Hashemite king, Ali ibn al-Hussein, was defeated in 1924.
Then Mecca and Medina fell.
Mecca in 1924, Medina in December 1925. And the notes say he finished the unification by assassinating Rashid in the north. A long, often brutal process.
And the material explicitly says this whole thing was accompanied and supported by the understanding of Wahhabi ideology.
Right, which raises a really interesting question, doesn't it? How did Ibn Saud actually balance the, hard-nosed realities of tribal politics and military conquest with this really potent religious ideology of Wahhabism, especially with its most zealous followers, the Ikhwan?
That's a crucial dynamic. The material definitely dives into that. Let's unpack how it describes Wahhabism and the Ikhwan.
Okay.
Wahhabism is presented as this very, very austere form of Islam, really focused on returning to what it calls the original version of the faith.
By rejecting historical developments.
Exactly. And forbidding practices like venerating saints, tombs, amulets, incense, that sort of thing. Founded by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab way back in the 18th century in Darya, near modern Riyadh.
And the Saudi royal family follows this interpretation.
Yes. Then you have the Ikhwan, which means the brethren. They're described as religious warriors, even marauders, an extension of the Wahhabi movement.
When did they emerge?
Mid-19th century Nejd, according to the notes. Founded by ultra-conservative clerics who were worried about modernization.
So starting scholarly, but becoming more militant.
Yeah, evolved into this reformist movement, really driven to purify society of everything human, as the notes put it, criminals, folk traditions, imperialism, capitalism, modernity itself.
Wow. Intense.
There's this striking detail about them burning provincial mosques because their festive religious broadcasts were attracting too many listeners.
That says a lot. And their role in unification was key.
Crucial. The material calls them the sword of the desert tribes, used by both Ibn Saud and, well, Wahhab, though the connection there needs careful handling to bolster power and conquer territory, like Al-Hassa.
They are the shock troops, basically.
Pretty much. They conquered Mecca and Medina in 1924, and the notes say they declared them the house of the Lord, warranting his mercy.
But the material also mentions a split between Ibn Saud and Wahhab.
It does. It suggests Ibn Saud wanted to rule using a soul-fed empire, whatever that quite means, and kind of win over these Arabs with vows of safety and security.
While Wahhab wanted to.
What? Curse the Arabs, apparently, and renounce their sinfulness. It sounds like a significant tension over how to govern.
Definitely.
And here's where we hit one of those confusing points in the material. One part says Wahhab was later killed by Ibn Saud's forces in 1925.
But he founded the movement in the 18th century. That timeline doesn't quite add up.
Exactly. It seems contradictory.
Right.
So we just have to present both points as they appear in the source material, acknowledging that tension exists within the accounts themselves.
Okay, fair enough. What about the Ikhwan themselves? Were they easy allies?
Not really. The notes describe them as unwieldy, filled with religious fervor and hatred of the infidel, and believing they could basically write their own rules.
So powerful, but hard to control.
Precisely. Their drive was essential, but their intensity made them difficult. The material mentions an Ikhwan uprising in March 1927.
Which Ibn Saud put down.
Yeah. brutally quelled by Ibn Saud's army. This whole episode, it just perfectly highlights that complex, sometimes really volatile relationship between the Al Saud's political goals and the fervent religious movement they relied on. Allies one minute, rivals the next.
A dynamic that clearly shaped the state.
Absolutely. Okay, so after navigating all that consolidating power, working with and sometimes against the Ikhwan, Ibn Saud takes the formal step. September 23, 1932. He proclaims the declaration of the kingdom.
And this officially brings together all those different parts, Riyadh, Najd, Hale, Asir, Hijaz,
into one single sovereign state. And the material notes, 1932 is the very first time the phrase Saudi Arabia is actually used in history.
That's significant.
It is. And this declaration is presented as the culmination of that whole struggle against the Turks and the Hashemites. Again, the notes explicitly say it happened, especially with the help of Wahhabi ideology.
And controlling Hijaz, Mecca, and Medina that gave the new kingdom immediate legitimacy and respect.
To position it as the center of pan-Islamism, yeah. So the kingdom is declared. What does this formal act actually mean for the future path of this newly unified land?
Well, it cements this new political reality, right? The Al Saud dynasty in charge, deeply intertwined with Wahhabi ideology. It creates the foundational structure that's going to face everything that comes next.
And what came next was oil.
Exactly. A discovery that would completely rewrite the kingdom's future. The material paints that picture of pre-oil Arabia as, poor, relatively isolated.
A desert state.
Yeah. And U.S. geologists started looking around in the late 1930s. They suspected there was oil in abundance, as the notes say.
But the U.S. didn't even recognize the kingdom yet.
Apparently not. The notes suggest the general view was still of a land of wild desert brigands. Kind of dismissive.
Until March 2nd, 1938. That's the big date.
Diamond number 7. The drill hits commercially viable oil at over 4,000 feet.
After years of searching, it was one of 14 exploratory rigs drilled since Aramco was created 11 years earlier. The notes say in a place called Bathan.
Right. And development moved fast after that discovery. Aramco built a pipeline to Ras Tanura on the Gulf by 1939.
The notes also mention Japan becoming involved, a member of the Arabian American Oil Company.
Yes, that's mentioned. And the financial side was huge, almost right away. President Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz agreed on these principles of equity.
Which meant?
Saudi Arabia got to keep a 50% share of the oil revenues for its own development. A major deal.
And the scale of the oil finds just kept growing. The Ghawar field mentioned later.
Discovered, or first well-drilled, 1951, the world's largest. Still producing today. The notes say it's 250 miles long, 27 miles wide. Just staggering.
Unbelievable scale.
And what's really crucial here, the material strongly suggests this oil wasn't just an economic thing. It fundamentally changed the kingdom's place in the world, reshaped everything internally.
Enormous wealth, but also demands.
Yeah, the material uses this phrase, immediate, wide, and ruthless penetration by powerful international capital. It even says that for the tribes, the real game changer wasn't conquest, it was oil.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. And that wealth flowing in, it fueled this period of just unprecedented modernization and prosperity, especially from the 50s through the 70s.
We see things like the Ministry of Petroleum being created.
Saudi Aramco becoming fully government-owned by June 1955, and that revenue pouring back into building infrastructure, health, education, the works.
Then comes 1973, the oil embargo, a huge global event.
Absolutely. Context of the Arab-Israeli War, Saudi Arabia and others restrict exports to the U.S., the Netherlands.
And the impact was immediate.
Dramatic. Prices quadrupled, Saudi crude revenues increased fivefold in months. It showed the world the power they now wielded.
The material briefly touches on the rulers during this time. King Faisal.
Assassinated in 75, succeeded by Khalid Abdulaziz, whose reign saw income rise even more because of those high prices.
Then Fahd ibn Abdulaziz took over in 82.
Right, and his era saw maybe a more measured pace of development after that initial boom.
But all this wealth, while transformative, didn't come without problems, right?
Yeah.
The material highlights some deep economic challenges.
Oh, definitely. Huge dependency on oil, for one. Like 90% of export revenues in the state budget. That makes you vulnerable.
Fear of price drops.
Exactly. And the constant need for pretty high economic growth, maybe 6% a year, just to keep up with the population growth, job demand, stability.
The notes also mention high energy use.
Yeah, using 7% of the world's energy on just 2% of the landmass. And it's forecast to grow, potentially even making Saudi Arabia a net energy importer down the line.
Wow. That points to the rentier economy model the material talks about.
Precisely. The state relies on oil rent and provides tax-free services and welfare to keep the population loyal. But that strains resources, creates huge demand.
And the big one, jobs. Saudization.
The goal of getting more Saudis into the workforce, it's tough, the notes say, because of reliance on foreign companies, which kind of disconnects income from local wealth creation.
Plus the demographics, a really young population.
Huge number of young people entering the job market every year. And the notes specifically point to youth unemployment, especially among young men, as a serious issue. They're less inclined towards sectors like health or education.
Compared to the public sector, jobs that used to be plentiful but aren't as much anymore.
Right. So massive wealth transformed the country, brought amazing progress, but also created these fundamental ongoing challenges. Jobs, diversification.
Which leads directly into Vision 2030.
The initiative put forward by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
And the stated goal is clear. Cut that oil dependence, diversify the economy.
The material lists some proposed ways. Restructuring fiscal policy, trying to link wages to productivity, encouraging small businesses for jobs.
Aligning education with job market needs, shrinking the public sector below 20% to boost private growth.
Phasing out subsidies, easing capital market rules, it's ambitious.
Theory. But the material also flags challenges for Vision 2030.
It does. Mentions a lack of major fossil fuel reform itself, existing problems plus new ones threatening implementation, and just the fundamental nature of that rentier state model. It's hard to change something so deeply ingrained.
So the big question hanging over it is, can they really make that fundamental shift?
Can they move away from oil dependency and that rentier system? Or will history and current challenges prove too much of an obstacle for these goals? It's a huge question.
Shifting from the economy to the political structure. The material describes it as an absolute monarchy.
Rule passes through kings and successors, based on Islamic law, Quran, Sunnah, consensus. The king is sovereign.
Appoints ministers, governors. Decisions made by consensus in the king's inner circle, it says.
There are other bodies mentioned too, like a council of bigger gentry, advising, appointing military officers, shaping policy, members from gentry, tribes, and the king's appointees.
But there are significant restrictions noted too.
Yeah, political parties, groups banned, independent press, book publishing, media too, and public debate on sensitive stuff like taxes, cost of living, social issues, apparently avoided.
Why? Fear of destabilization.
That's what the material suggests, yeah.
And digging deeper into Islam's role in governing. It's the official religion, laws derived from Quran and Sunnah.
And Wahhabism is presented as a major trend, officially promoted since the start, followed by the royals. The Grand Mufti, the top religious figure, appointed by the king.
This filters down through state institutions.
Absolutely. State schools focus heavily on religion. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs manages mosques, public preaching, religious publishing, supervises imams, recruits scholars trained in Wahhabi theology. It's pervasive.
The material also mentions social control elements, religious police.
Overseeing Islamic duties, yeah. Limited freedoms around sexuality, entertainment. The notes say some critics even compare the rules and the use of religious authorities to enforce them with Taliban-ruled Afghanistan.
So putting it all together, the picture is a state where political power is just profoundly tied to this specific, austere interpretation of Islam. It shapes everything.
Law, education, daily life. It's presented as absolutely fundamental to the state's identity.
And that close link between the rulers and the religious establishment.
Yeah.
It hasn't always been smooth sailing, has it? The material mentions complexities, tensions.
Right, like the royal family needing to manage the Ulamah's power. They even passed a law about the religious establishment back in 1960.
And there were early signs of discontent mentioned. Criticism in pamphlets, discussion groups.
Calls for al-Shura councils, suggested for local districts even. People wanting more say.
The material identifies different opposition sources over time. Arab nationalists.
Yeah, a coup attempt mentioned in 1954. Factions leaning towards pan-Arabism, Marxism, socialism, finding sympathy among workers, students, professionals, often influenced by ideas from Egypt or Syria.
Political debate groups starting to organize opposition.
And the royal family's response. The notes mention intelligence agencies tracking groups, but also things like the king giving cash prizes for memorizing the Quran and olive branch to tradition.
Alongside arrests and preachers speaking against materialism, a mix of tactics.
Definitely. There's that really specific example, the building workers of Dhahran Federation petitioning King Saud, demanding job classifications, reinstatement for union activity, tenure, representation.
Escalated.
Protests, even a hunger strike by wives. The notes say King Saud initially agreed, but then disbanded the city government and redistricted the town described as an attempt to cut work memory. Pretty drastic.
It sounds like King Saud faced growing opposition.
From various levels, yeah, which led to him handing over political power to Prince Faisal in 1964.
And Faisal brought reforms, modernization, participation.
Aimed at that, yes. But according to the material, his reforms hit stiff backlash from traditional tribesmen and the ulama in 1965. He also developed a secret police agency.
And the note suggests that just having more wealth didn't automatically mean more satisfaction for everyone. Discontent could still rise.
Exactly. So it's really not just a simple top-down story. The material reveals this constant push and pull, different parts of society asserting themselves, sometimes leading to protests or opposition. Those internal dynamics are always there.
And one really significant area where you see that dynamic, that tension between change and tradition, is women's rights and roles. The notes dedicate space to this.
Yeah, it's clearly highlighted as important. The challenges are laid out. Years of conservative interpretations of Islam pushed by modern religious leaders.
Daily harassment, limits on freedom in public, strict dress codes, vehicle registration issues.
Yet the notes also acknowledge women's contributions. They hold positions of authority, have advanced society. It mentions the first televised female Olympians and managers as signs of resilience.
What about demands from women?
Better education, using media for better political representation, wanting elections for councils linked to the king for real representation, pointing out the disparity, like only 1 in 31 government posts held by women despite being nearly half the population, and those posts were assigned.
External pressure mentioned too. Academics, activists, the UN.
Yes, and there's that key historical protest highlighted, 1990, Riyadh. 47 women broke the law by driving.
What happened?
Arrested, beaten, passports confiscated. Now, one part of a note says they ultimately changed the law, but
here's another one of those contradictions within the source material itself. Another section clearly states that as of 2015, women still didn't have the right to drive autonomously or even leave the house alone.
So conflicting accounts on progress right there in the notes.
Exactly. We have to present both as they appear, showing that tension.
And the notes also point to the current dynamic. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman promoting rights, but the religious establishment maintaining conservative values.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How does that push for modernization, like Vision 2030, really mesh with these deeply rooted conservative values, especially regarding women, when the material itself gives conflicting signals about the pace of change?
It's a central tension.
Moving beyond politics and economics, the material talks about a rich cultural heritage, profoundly shaped by Islam.
Most people are Islamic. Traditions and customs have huge influence on daily life.
The Hajj and pilgrimage are obviously central. Millions visit Mecca and Medina yearly. Those holy cities are deeply revered cultural and religious anchors.
Daily life follows Islamic guidelines, meals, clothing, activities, the 5 daily prayers when public places pause, and the restriction. Non-Muslims aren't allowed in Mecca or Medina.
Mosques are everywhere, culturally and historically important learning centers, though the notes hint they can sometimes be polarizing places too.
And tribal identity still matters. Ethnicity, clan, tribe, they still shape what the material calls the tribal primary Islamic character. It provides some unity despite different tribes and dialects.
The overall picture is culturally and socially conservative, with Islam as the backbone. But the material also mentions progress in arts and literature under various rulers. Libraries, for instance.
Yeah, the King Abdulaziz Library in Riyadh, established way back around 1930-31, and others in regions, universities, ministries.
Holding what kind of collections?
Rich stuff. Rare manuscripts, literature, history, old poetry, accounts of the peninsula, plus modern publications. It's all documented.
And this growth in culture and education is linked to oil.
Directly. The notes say oil money was poured into education, importing experts, led to rapid growth in schools, universities exceeding expectations, especially compared to the very high illiteracy rate, 94%, noted in the early pre-oil years.
So it's not just a state, It's a place with this deep conservative cultural identity based on Islam and tribal history, but also with this rapidly developed modern education and cultural sector fueled by oil.
A real blend. Now, shifting to foreign relations, the material describes the early days, foundation up to the 50s, as cultivating ties with the U.S., sometimes at Britain's expense, it seems.
But that shifted.
Pro-American stance was shaken by the Suez Crisis in 1956. Then King Faisal, after Saud, tried to court both superpowers.
By the late 60s, the U.S. presence was significant, mainly through oil.
Yeah, control of the Arabian petroleum industry. But tensions arose in the early 70s regional turmoil, the Arab-Israeli conflict. The notes mention Saudi Arabia having a wait-and-see attitude during Jordan's 1970 defeat, ignoring U.S. calls to land troops despite U.S. pressure.
Muted responses to border issues, too.
And then, of course, the big one we already discussed, the 1973 oil embargo, huge impact on foreign relations.
Looking specifically at the U.S. and Britain, Britain pulling back drew more U.S. attention.
Seems so. For the U.S., the stakes were huge oil potential, strategic value. That 1933 Dam discovery marked the start of serious Saudi-American cooperation. U.S. provided development, finance.
Though limited initially by the depression affecting oil revenues.
Right, but cooperation ramped up during WWII Saudi commitments for U.S. security guarantees, then post-WWII events in Iran, Iraq, Egypt. The material calls it the American takeover of British interests.
And internal politics affected relations. King Saud's issues.
Perceived ineptitude, corruption by the late 50s invited coup fears, accusations, leading to Faisal taking over. Faisal's reforms created a new ruling coalition, integrating families, bureaucracy, consulting the educated middle class, trying to build loyalty during modernization.
But alienated some royals.
Apparently. Then Faisal was assassinated in 75 by a nephew, succeeded by Khalid. His reign saw more unrest, terror attacks targeting foreigners, and the oil industry, according to the notes.
It's striking how directly the material connects oil, internal stability or instability, and these shifting foreign relations, especially with the West competing for influence.
They're all linked. Which brings us to the wider regional dynamics and conflicts. The material situates Saudi Arabia in that turbulent Middle East period of 68-78.
Impact of the 67 Six-Day War defeat. British withdrawal east of Suez in 71, the 73 Yom Kippur War.
All stimulating more U.S. involvement to secure stability and oil access. Saudi strategy, the notes say, was basically trading oil for American security assistance.
The Arab-Israeli conflict became more central to Saudi interests after 67.
Facing vulnerabilities at home and abroad, yeah. Security ties with the U.S. deepened, often pushed by the U.S.
But there was friction. The U.S. arms sales to Israel.
Big concern for the Saudis' fear of a direct military threat. The material mentions sales of F-15s and an IMIS contract went ahead after talks. The note suggests this issue was so significant it helped keep the relationship from totally collapsing during the 74 oil embargo fallout.
What other regional influences are mentioned? Nasser.
Nasser's Arab nationalism made him a hero post-Baghdad Pact collapse, prompting King Saud to pull back from the West. The coup in Iraq bringing Qasim to power, his troops moving towards Kuwait. Assad in Syria claiming superiority.
British actions mentioned, too, against threats to India, involving dismantling Arab nationalism and penetrating Saudi Arabia, raising fears of communism, tribalism.
Yeah, and a U.S. aerial exercise to deter that threat. A complex web of regional rivalries and great power involvement.
But Arab nationalism eventually declined.
Discredited after the 67 defeat, the notes say.
The material also loops back to internal conflicts and terrorism, reiterating that root conflict over interpretations of Islam and the Al Saud religious authority relationship, going back to Abdulaziz and the Ikhwan.
Yes, and interestingly, there's a point made that the Ikhwan's power was waxing back in the 1850s when they allied with the British imperial government.
Which again seems chronologically odd compared to their 20th century role.
Yeah.
Another inconsistency in the source material itself.
Exactly. The notes also suggest growing dissatisfaction led to more extremist groups. And then there's this statement that the Al Ikhwan was progressively slaughtered as the Al Saud ruled out political opposition from the late 1960s.
Which also seems to contradict the earlier accounts of them being suppressed in the 1920s.
Right. We just have to note these discrepancies as presented in the material we have. It highlights the complexity, maybe even the contested nature of the historical narrative itself.
But a really key event the notes emphasize is the 1979 Mecca Grand Mosque siege.
A group of armed extremists taking over Islam's holiest site lasted 4 days, ended with casualties when the mosque was liberated.
The material calls it a key turning point. Why?
Because it apparently changed the outside perception of Saudi Arabia, making it seem like an extremist state, while paradoxically, it secured the ruling family's position at home
Wow.
by letting them project legitimacy through the religious authorities, binding their power even closer to the ulema, a complex outcome.
It really highlights how everything is connected. External conflicts, superpower relations, internal religious and political tensions. They all feed off each other.
Profoundly shaping the kingdom's policies and stability.
So let's try and pull these threads together from the material you shared for this deep dive. We've seen the creation of the kingdom wasn't simple. It was this complex unification by Abdulaziz Al Saud, bringing together divided territories.
And the material shows Islam, specifically Wahhabism, as just fundamental, shaping identity, law, society, but with those internal tensions and differing interpretations always present, as the notes revealed.
Then oil arrives and completely transforms everything, from a poor desert state to immense wealth, driving modernization, global standing.
But also bringing huge challenges. That dependency, the urgent need to diversify, creating jobs for a massively young population, those are ongoing struggles.
And we saw the political landscape.
Yeah.
The monarchy, the religious establishments, security forces, managing public discontent, navigating those complex foreign relations shaped by oil, regional conflict, global powers.
Yeah, a constant balancing act.
So understanding these foundations, that mix of absolute monarchy, deep religious influence, oil wealth, and the social and economic challenges, it seems absolutely crucial if you want to make sense of Saudi Arabia today. Its actions, its place in the world, initiatives like Vision 2030, its regional role, it all stems from this history.
It's a history of unification, yes, but also massive transformation and these persistent evolving challenges. So building on everything we've unpacked from the material, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The sources consistently highlight this ongoing tension, don't they? Between the weight of traditional structures, religion, tribalism, and the intense pressures of modernization, diversification, and a young population demanding opportunities.
That central tension runs through everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
So given this deep history of managing internal dissent and external pressures, the question becomes, how will the kingdom balance these competing forces in the decades ahead? And what could that balancing act, or perhaps failure to balance, mean for its future direction? Something to think about.